From the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.
We're on the road again. There we go. This is David Cline for the Smithsonian and the National Museum of African American History and Culture and the Library of Congress. Today is Friday, March the 1st, and I'm in Burlingame, California, with Mr. Steve McNichols. Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for talking with us today.
The pleasure is mine.
Okay. What I'd like to do, Steve, is first just ask you to tell us a little bit about where you were raised and the family that you were raised in.
Yeah, I'd like to dwell for just a moment on my origins, if I may, because it's important. My maternal grandparents, Yitzhak and Olga Frank, emigrated from Eastern Europe, Riga and Mariupol, to Palestine in 1890. They were part of an emigration movement sponsored by the Rothschilds. In fact, I think he worked for the Rothschilds. And they moved to Palestine, where they founded, were one of 11 families who founded the city of Tel Aviv, which instantaneously gives me more status in Israel than I'll ever have anywhere else, you know? And their names are engraved on Founder's Mark. I have a picture of my uncle standing in front of Founder's Mark. And my grandfather built the first residential dwelling home in Tel Aviv. Pardon me, which is on a tour. A lot of the tourists that go through Tel Aviv. And my mother was born there. And then when my mother was 5 years old, my grandmother was having health problems. So they separated and she moved to Geneva with my grandparents. And my mother relocated to Geneva, where she became a classically trained violinist and was Joseph Szigeti's prize pupil and toured with him before coming to the United States, which was probably a mistake. I think the whole family should have stayed in Geneva. That's where their heads were at. But they moved to the United States along with Andrei Kostelanetz and some other people. And that background is very important to me, even though I'm not observant, not an observant Jew. But it's important to me as a person, you know, and something I feel strongly about. So, I was born in New York in 1939. My mother was this classically trained violinist. Her violin was stolen as soon as she hooked up with my father, no connection. And she stopped playing violin for 14 years. My father was brought up in a very tough neighborhood in St. Louis. His father was a thug who was murdered when my father was 3. And my father was a very tough guy. Very smart, actually. Intellectually curious. Well-read, but I think he got a GED. And I didn't appreciate him enough as a child because I was supposed to be a genius. And I discovered what the word precocious really means. It means that you're way ahead of everybody else up to about age 13, and then your peers start passing you. And instead of being, you know, so much more brilliant than they are, you're lucky to stay in the top third, you know what I mean? But we lived in a very tough neighborhood in New York, 103rd Street, Manhattan Avenue. I was the only white kid in my neighborhood. But I went to Dalton, one of the most prestigious private schools in the country, on a full scholarship. Okay. So during the day, I would go to school with children of some of the wealthiest people in the country. Averell Harriman's nephew, Marshall Field's niece, and others, many others. And then I would return to the ghetto at night. And it was a kind of a schizoid existence for me, because I was very sensitive and very impressionable, very conscious of the fact that I came from a very poor background and lived in a very poor neighborhood.
What was the racial, ethnic composition of that neighborhood?
I was the only white kid in the neighborhood.
In an African-American neighborhood?
Puerto Rican.
Puerto Rican,
Yeah. And I was lucky because it still was not as bad as East Harlem. It was bad. My father went to work one day and saw a body lying in the street. But because I lived there, I grew up there, I got along with the other kids, pretty much. We had fights, but other than that, I was accepted, you know? I was Steve, who was kind of the strange kid who lived in the neighborhood.
So being that you had this, living in a largely Puerto Rican neighborhood and then going to Dalton, were you thinking about race and difference and class at all at a young age? Do you remember when
it was
you
in the air.
processed this?
It was, I couldn't help but think about it because I was surrounded by it. But my goal was to get the hell out of there. And my mother was driving me to succeed, so I wouldn't have the same kind of life that she had, you know?
What did your father do for work in this?
Whatever he could. I mean, he had various sort of uninteresting jobs. He worked in a lab animal facility, but to his credit, just to show you what kind of a man he was, he started taking electronics courses and taught himself radio and television electronics, and then became a trainee for Picker X-ray. And most of his peers had engineering degrees. And he was the top trainee in his training class, one of the best repairmen. So he was remarkable, really, in his own way. You know, I couldn't have done that. So my folks separated. My mother was very anxious to leave my father, which was really a mistake. And we separated. And remarkably, she supported herself by teaching French to employees of Time Life and started making a very good living. First time we had money in my life. And then, unfortunately, she developed psychiatric symptoms and had a big breakdown in the middle of the Time Life lobby at noon one day. And the whole thing, she was institutionalized, the whole thing fell apart. And I went back to living with my father.
Okay. How old were you at that time?
I was 16.
Okay.
And my father really stepped into the breach, which I'm not sure it was necessary that he do. But he really came through like gangbusters, even though we never really got along, But he really saved my neck, psychiatrically speaking,
Right.
And I went into a permanent depression. Every day of my life since about age 15, I suffered from suicidal ideation for 50 years. Until we discovered when I was 65 years old that I actually have a bipolar condition. And once we started treating that, the depression lifted. And I became much more functional as a person.
What did you do? What was the treatment for bipolar?
Pardon me?
What is the treatment for bipolar?
Lithium. But I didn't get any treatment because I wasn't diagnosed as bipolar. So my whole life was spent seeing psychiatrists who were treating me for depression when they should have been treating me for a bipolar condition.
Right.
You know? Not one of them guessed
Hmm.
that it was a bipolar condition. And it was only by accident we discovered at age 65 when my cardiologist, I returned from Mexico where I'd been living, sent me for a panel of tests. And one of the tests, the lab technician wrote down that my lithium serum level was virtually non-existent.
Hmm.
Well, it turns out, which is not really indicative of being bipolar, but triggered
Right.
an investigation,
Okay.
a review.
Right. Hmm. But so starting in your teens, you're
Well,
operating under
the whole episode
yeah.
with my mother being institutionalized
Hmm.
was living with my mother for 2 years while she deteriorated psychiatrically was extremely depressing.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah.
I was extremely isolated. I mean, I had friends, but I was in a world by myself. My mother and I were both seeing a psychiatrist who was, in my opinion, totally irresponsible and unprofessional. And when he concluded that we both had psychiatric problems, he just ran in the opposite direction instead of helping us deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
I'll never forget him. You know? I'd like to run into him now,
Yeah.
if I had any strength.
Yeah.
It was very sad,
Mm-hmm.
you know? On the other hand, to use a cliche, it was a tremendous learning experience.
Mm-hmm. So that was around age 16. So you're the next couple of years.
It was
of
when
high
I
school.
turned my 16th birthday,
Okay. So
March of 55, I guess.
so take me through the next couple of years. then.
Well, I was going to Stuyvesant High School, and my father and I gradually kind of separated from each other. I mean, we still lived together, he supported me, but he started spending more and more time with his girlfriend, 40-year-old woman I didn't care for. And I was on my own more and more. And then I remember I was lying in bed and I was talking with my father. We had a railroad apartment. He said, "What are you going to do, Steve?" He said, "You're 18 years old. What are you going to do after you graduate from Stuyvesant?" And I don't know where it came from, but I was trying to become a champion tennis player. I got the idea that I would leave home, go to Los Angeles, play tennis and work for a year, and then go to UCLA. And I laid it out for him. He said, "That's it, that's it." He said, "That's perfect." And that's what I did. And I got into a car with somebody else who was driving to Denver, drove to Denver, flew to LA, arrived at LAX at night, didn't know anybody, had some money that my father gave me, rented a room at the YMCA, and started to work and support myself, and started my long sojourn at UCLA, where I spent about twice as much time as I really needed to,
Right.
you know.
And at what point did, going back to your mother again, at what point did they discover what was going on with your mother?
Well, after 7 or 8 years, her tumor became so bad that she couldn't walk without staggering. And that's when a nurse or somebody said, "Say, I think she's got a physical problem." And that's when they discovered it. And that's when they operated to remove her tumor,
Mm-hmm.
you know? They conducted some tests or what have you.
Right.
But it was too late. Well, they blew the operator. You know? another doctor I'd like to get my hands on.
So
You
she
know,
didn't
'cause-
survive that.
Yeah, they didn't. They took the tumor out, but didn't replace it with anything. And half an hour after the operation, the walls of her brain collapsed and she died. So I get a phone call asking for authority, since I was the next of kin, to do the operation. And then I get another phone call saying she died.
Mm.
And that was her life.
Mm.
That was the last 10 years of her life. And it was this beautiful, cultured, educated woman. Never had a chance. In the medical establishment.
Let's pause for a second.
Sure.
And just to work with the machine.
We're back. I just wanted to make the files up clear.
So you were in Los Angeles at that
I
time?
was in LA,
Yeah.
working and supporting myself and going to UCLA. And every spare moment I had was devoted to the civil rights movement.
So what were you, first of all, what were you studying at UCLA?
Well, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was lost, you know? I mean, the whole UCLA scene was alien to me. You know, I arrived on campus and there were all these middle-class kids running around I couldn't really identify with anymore. But interestingly enough, I plunged into student politics, which is how I got involved in the civil rights movement, and started climbing the political ladder at UCLA.
Okay.
Became very active politically, made some pretty heavyweight contact. Howard Berman and Henry Waxman became part of their machine, and became active in the National Student Association. Went to NSA congresses, and just started climbing the political ladder
So
any
this
way
is
I could.
What year about?
Well, I actually entered UCLA in '58.
Okay. So what was the National Student Association concerned with? What were the sort of major issues, I guess, at that point? when you
Well,
first got involved?
the major issues were international. There was this Cold War going on between the International Student Union, which I believe was a communist front. I know it was a communist front. And our organization, the International Student Conference, if I don't have them confused. I don't think I do. And our people were being trained by the CIA and going off to conferences all over the world in this Cold War to influence other student unions. And there were some pretty hairy episodes, you know. We had people, and we had half a dozen offices around the world. There was the International Student Conference, had a secretariat in Europe. And the CIA was spending money and assigning heavyweights to run this network. It was a CIA network. And the head of the network is a guy named Bob Cline, who had been president of NSA, who had set the whole network up. And became, wound up going to work for the CIA and ultimately became Richard Helm's special assistant. So, and there's some interesting stories about that.
But back at UCLA, what were the primary things that you were involved
Well, we got caught up in the whole thing.
in? Okay.
So we thought we were important because we were part of this. We didn't realize it was a CIA front. You know, we thought we were just students doing this
Right.
with certain foundations. They had the Youth and Student Foundation, of all things. Can you imagine? They're running this network and you have something called the Youth and Student Foundation, it's absurd. You know, you might as well have said, hey, we're over here, you know?
So what first drew you to what was going on with civil rights in the United States?
I don't know, but from the moment I heard about the sit-ins, I was attracted. I wanted to go on a sit-in. I wanted to be involved. I was desperate to be a freedom rider. It was, you know, to me, it was a chosen thing. I would be lucky if I could be a freedom rider. That's how I felt about it.
So how were you getting news about these things?
Well, that's what's so interesting, because the LA Times and other news outlets weren't really covering the movement. So we had it verbally, through kind of a pipeline from the east to the west. So we heard about the sit-ins long before anybody else in LA knew about them. And I didn't get it. I was from New York. Why were people sitting in Kresge's and what have you? To eat lunch? That didn't make sense to me. We can eat lunch wherever we wanted, you know? And then after a while, it dawned on me what was really going on here. They couldn't go to Kresge's or whatever in the South and Midwest. In the East, blacks couldn't be served. I was stunned. I was shocked. And that's when we started to throw ourselves into the movement. And we started having, I didn't really participate in any of those demonstrations. I was very active in the student political party. I was head of a platform, the student political party at UCLA. And but students at UCLA started demonstrating outside of Kresge's and other places to let
Sort of
people eat.
sympathy
And lunch counters,
yeah, demonstrations, yeah. Mostly white students, or were there black students?
Mostly white. I have to tell you, the black students were very apathetic. All they cared about, I hate to say this, but it was true at that time, all they cared about was parties, their social life. They would get together in the same part of the cafeteria every day, socialize with each other, eat lunch, and then split. That's all they cared about. And we had a hard time getting them involved. We kept trying to get them involved. And it took several years before they even got involved. And then they finally did get involved, which had some real implications. There was a shooting at UCLA, you know, which happened after I left.
Okay, you weren't around for that.
Yeah.
Right, yeah, things really blew up there later, yeah.
And what shocked me, you know, because I didn't think UCLA was that militant. But
so, can you tell me just a little bit about how the idea of having freedom rides leave from Los Angeles emerged, and how you all planned that activity? 1 second.
yeah, it's a funny story. There are two black attorneys in Houston, George Washington Jr. and Hama King.
The second one?
Hama, Hamah King. And these guys were real hustlers, although they were also very good attorneys, very good civil rights attorneys. And they were so driven that they were challenging the black establishment, which wanted nothing to do with it, okay? They even formed their own black club. I forget the name of it, but it's in my oral history problem. And they got the idea of arranging for a Freedom Ride to come to Houston. And the third member of this trio was a guy named Theodore Hogo Brooks. Hogo Brooks.
Okay.
He was a great guy, but he was a crook. He was a fence. He owned five clubs in the 5th Ward. And it's very funny because on the one hand, he was extremely bourgeois, got very upset when he discovered we're in the same jail with an infamous young woman who had murdered the man who kept her. I mean, he was just blown away by that. And his daughter also was a Freedom Rider and went with us on the Freedom Ride.
Huh.
So they got Mr. Hogerbrooks to put up the necessary cash. And they called James Farmer and they said, hey, all the Freedom Rides pretty much had gone. Although there was still 2 or 3 we didn't know about. And they said, listen, send a Freedom Ride to Houston and we will take care of the cost, a couple of $1,000s, and represent them.
Can you just tell us who James Farmer is?
Yeah, James Farmer was head of CORE, who had founded CORE, was one of the original Freedom Riders. And Farmer was in New York, and Farmer agreed. So, for some reason, they decided to send this Freedom Ride from LA. I don't know why. Maybe it stopped sending Freedom Rides from New York. And Los Angeles CORE, which was headed up by a great guy. What was his name? I can see his face. It'll come back to me. Started organizing the Freedom Ride. And that's when I discovered, I was a student at LA City College at the time. I dropped out of UCLA. And I thought, oh my God, that's great. I've got a chance to go on a Freedom Ride. I can be a Freedom Rider. And that's when I volunteered for the Houston Freedom Ride. And that's when they started putting it together.
I'll just ask you that question again. So the director of LACOR was
Earl Walters. And he was being challenged by a couple of very ambitious black people, guys. And was doing a great job of sort of holding him off. They kept trying to make him look bad. Henry Hodge and the other one who later became a state senator. Pardon me. I can see his face. I can't remember his name. Bill somebody or other. And they kept trying to undermine him with the group. You know, anything they can do to embarrass him, make him look bad, humiliate him, they did. And he hung in there anyway because it was extremely important for him to stay there and not be driven out of the group. And to this day, I'm trying to remember the name of the guy who became a state senator. It was hysterical. When they heard about the Freedom Ride to Houston, Henry Hodge and the other guy immediately jumped up and started saying, we'll go to Houston, we'll go on the Freedom Ride to Houston. Of course, they never showed up. You know? Just hysterical. I remember standing on the train and looking around, they were nowhere to be seen, you know? So it was pretty funny.
Was Earl Walter very involved in getting you all together?
Pardon me?
Was Earl Walter, the core office, very involved in getting you together, or
Oh yeah, they sponsored the Freedom Ride. They got the money, they bought the tickets, paid for the ticket, and they trained us.
Can you tell me about what that training was?
It's a good question because it really didn't help us very much. It was basically a lot of stuff. We spent 2 days in somebody's home practicing situations. What was so funny about it, it all focused on being attacked by a white mob at Union Station. Nothing about what to do after you were arrested. So it was virtually no help. And they kept using me to try to be the white racist attacking them. And I couldn't pull it off. I mean, I couldn't even get upset, you know? Because I didn't have anything against my friend. Just funnier than hell. So, what was also funny is that Cline, when I showed up the first day at LACOR, was told to show up. I was the second person, I think, to volunteer for that Freedom Ride. And Cline had just gone down to Union Station, bought some tickets, and returned. And I remember telling him, you know, there were two railroad companies that went to Houston. And she didn't know which one to get, so she just got one of them and turned out to be the wrong one. Because the one she got was for Southern Pacific. And we didn't know it until we actually arrived in Houston. But they had gotten rid of their lunch counter and replaced it with vending machine. So there was no way we could integrate them, but that's where we were headed. So we wound up leaving on August 9th to go on the Freedom Ride to Houston, Texas.
Who was in the group? Of how many were you? And
There were 11 of us. And Bob Kaufman was from Berkeley. And I didn't know this, but apparently he was a prominent member of the Communist Party. And Henry Hotz selected him to be in charge of our Freedom Ride. And was attacked for doing that by other core members.
so how many men and women in black and white?
I think it was 5 and 6. I'm trying to remember. So we only had a couple of black. We had Charles Berard, was a member of the West Coast student movement, really. That's how we all really got involved. We had all been involved in the West Coast student movement. And there were several others. And, you know, we wound up leaving on in the afternoon and arrived in the morning a day later in Houston.
And the train trip itself was uneventful or eventful?
Uneventful except for the fact that an FBI agent joined our group in El Paso. And he really looked like an FBI agent. He was this big, husky, older guy, very well dressed. And the black porters told us that he was going to join our I'm sorry, our group, you know,
Yeah.
in El Paso.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting there, and we pull into El Paso, and I suddenly looked up, and here's this guy coming right into our. We had the whole car
Yeah.
practically to ourselves. You know, the porters would set us up so we could have meetings and so on and so forth.
So you got some support from the train porters?
Oh, tremendous. On the way down there, the way back was different.
Okay.
Because we were very bitter on the way back.
Mm.
And suddenly I look up and here's this guy. I mean, he was obviously the FBI agent. I remember dropping something because I was so shocked. And he just walked up nearby and sat down at one of the tables. And somebody asked him if he worked for the railroad, and he said he did. But of course, he was an FBI agent. You know. And then we showed up in Houston, and we discovered, when we showed up in Houston, there was no lunch counter, nothing to integrate. And George Washington and Hamid King arranged to pick us up and take us to their office. And the local Freedom Riders was Progressive Student Association, and that's where we went. And we waited there while they changed our tickets to the other, you know, other terminal.
Right.
So we would have tickets to the right terminal.
Okay. And did you have tickets on from Houston, or was it just to Houston?
I'm sorry?
Were you supposed to go on from Houston?
No, this is what's so interesting. We were told that, and if I may say so, God blessed me with a rather extraordinary long-term memory. I can't remember where I put my car keys, but I remember things dating back 50 years, no problem. I know what happened. And what happened is we were told that we would go to Houston, and if we were not arrested in Houston, because we were there to integrate, you know, the coffee shop, and we were there to challenge the law in Texas, we would then go on to Jackson, Mississippi. But our tickets didn't connect to Jackson, and they weren't supposed to. We were going to Houston, okay? Now, there are people who believe that we were supposed to go on to Jackson, and Houston was just kind of a, you know, almost an afterthought. That's not right. I mean, after all, Hema and George organized the whole thing and raised money and were, you know, representing us. And you had the Progressive Student Association, not just half a dozen people, but they had supporters in Houston. So the whole thing, Houston was the target for us. Unless, if we had walked up to the coffee shop and we had been admitted and we had desegregated the coffee shop, then we would have gone on to Jacksonville. otherwise, the idea was to get arrested in Houston, challenge. I think there were some local statutes, segregation statutes, Jim Crow statutes, and we were challenging all of that.
Were you getting news from Jackson? Do you know what was going on there with the other?
No.
No, not really.
No.
So you were really on your own.
Yeah. We would get occasionally, Bob would call New York Core, and we would be told about something,
Okay.
and that was it.
So take us. We'll start again from where.
We're rolling.
Okay. So thank you. Let's start with. I guess you took us to the office.
Yeah, we were
Washington's
taken,
office.
and then we were taken to a black restaurant, which was set up in a parking lot, and what it was what's the term I'm thinking of? You know when you go and you get black food?
Soul food.
Soul food. Soul food restaurant. First time I ever had soul food. I was shocked at how good it tasted. I looked at it and I said, it doesn't look, what's this? And it was, whatever it was. And it was delicious. Just delicious. And they bought us lunch. And meanwhile, Bob and I think one of the attorneys were changing our tickets. And they came back, picked us up, and that afternoon we went to the Union Station. And we went in, and the Union City, the Union Center lunch counter was run by a guy whose name I've just slipped my mind. Terrible racist. And we formed a line in front of the place while he held the door shut so we couldn't come in. So he finally walked away from the door so we could come in and he could have us arrested. And we...
You had joined up with the Progressive Student Association, so how many...
I'm sorry?
You had joined forces at this point with members of the Progressive Student Association?
Yeah, there were 18 of us all together.
18 of you. Can you describe the group of 18?
I don't know what to tell you. We were all well dressed. It was in the day when everybody who participated in demonstrations would wear coats and ties. before the more radical dress wear, and very well mannered. And we just stood in line, and meanwhile Bob and others kept calling out to the guy who owned the lunch counter, what was his name? Asking him to let us in. And he finally walked away and let us in. And it took us a moment to realize we could walk in. And we walked in and sat down at the lunch counter and at some booths. And it was very interesting because we thought everybody would be against us. But the people who worked there, the waitresses, were all for us. You know? And they started whispering to us. You know? And I remember we said a couple of sarcastic things. Bet you don't want us here. And they said, oh no. We want you here.
These are white waitresses?
White waitresses. And, you know, that really says a lot. That the working waitresses, white, wanted us there. Were all for us. They couldn't say so, because they would lose their jobs. And it took, meanwhile, a crowd assembled, and the police were sent for, and
Was the crowd inside or outside of the...
right outside. In the parking lot, really, but right in front of the doors. And we were told that they wanted us to leave, of course. A couple of guys showed up who threatened us as part of the crowd, but they never followed up on it. I mean, one guy walked back and forth the club and said, I'll take care of them. Never had the guts to walk in and actually confront us. Because, you know, we were obeying the non, what's the word I'm looking for?
Nonviolence?
Nonviolent standards. We weren't necessarily nonviolent, but we were being nonviolent.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? So you had studied it, but about the sort of conflict that, did you see that there might be other ways, but this was one way too?
I'm not sure I understand.
About the difference between the philosophical position of nonviolence, how that was...
Yeah, I mean, our role was to be nonviolent, and CORE was nonviolent. And CORE was really nonviolent. I mean, they weren't faking it. It was important to them. I wasn't nonviolent. I mean, I came out of a tough neighborhood in New York. As far as I was concerned, we could beat the shit out of them if we could, you know? Who cared? But I was so, by that time, I was almost religious. I was so committed to CORE in the Freedom Ride. In fact, when we first got on the train and left LA, we were told to stay away from the bar car, not sing freedom song. And within about 15 minutes, we were in the bar car singing freedom song. And I was offended by that. I thought that was wrong, you know? But then I had a drink, a soft drink, and I sort of complained in a very pure way to Bob Kaufman about it, and he said, I'm having a scotch, you know? So, and two of the guys who were with us had brought some marijuana on board with them, and two or three of them hung out in the men's room smoking marijuana. You know, it was obvious, with a lot of giggling come from the men's room. So when we arrived in when we were actually sitting, I started to get scared. And I remember turning to the guy next to me, the local student, and saying, you know, I am really beginning to get scared. I don't know if I can do this. And he forcefully sort of calmed me down and reinforced me. And then, when we were arrested, one of the local students was the last to be arrested. He stood up and announced to everybody, said, "Make my coat to go." And even guys who had been threatening, white guys, started laughing and thought it was hysterical, you know, and we were arrested. And we were not treated badly. And we were taken in these small, you know, cars to jail. And we were treated well. They drove very carefully, so we didn't have a lot of bounces. They treated us decently.
Did the police talk to you during that?
Huh?
Did the police officers talk to you while they were?
No. They didn't care. You know, later a couple of them talked to us, but not much. We were taken to the city jail and then transferred to the county jail, where we started having problems. So that's how we got arrested.
So then you were booked in and charged.
Well, we were booked in both the city and the county jail, but it was really the county jail. We were thrown into these holding cells, and we were processed through the booking. And it was very funny because we would be processed as, you know, well, the first thing that happened is they would pull us out. And the white males, we were in the middle cell, holding cell. And they started pulling people from the other cells first. And gradually, as time passed, the number of people in the holding cells really started going down, because the others were being placed in the black tanks, you know, like the two black tanks. And then finally, also, we're finally pulled into to be booked at about 2 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
And
So just to clarify, so white men were put in one place and black men in another, and white women and black women.
that's right,
Yeah, different cells.
different tanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they just had one white male tank and one white female tank. And but the black were put in separate black tanks. And we were taken up to be photographed and booked. And Steve, I can see his face, and I just can't remember his name at the moment. But he refused to cooperate, okay? Which was a mistake. And Steve, you know, we were told to say yes sir or no sir by the guy who was processing us. And Steve started talking back to him, which was a mistake. Shouldn't have done that. And I remember thinking, oh no, for God's sakes, don't do that. But he, in a very sarcastic voice, started talking back to the guy who was processing them. And I don't know if they were going to beat us up before that. My guess is they were. But that certainly finalized it. And we were then taken upstairs at about 2 o'clock in the morning and put in the white male misdemeanor tank. And I remember the deputy sheriff telling us to tell the prisoners what we were arrested for, and the point of that was to let the prisoners know that we were the Freedom Riders. Because I, like an idiot, I walked and told them I've been arrested for unlawful assembly. And the prisoner said, "You're one of those fucking nigger lovers." And I went, uh-oh. And we quickly found ourselves surrounded by about a half dozen tough-looking guys. Surrounded us, started putting us down verbally, and then walked us into the back and told us to lay down. And take off our shoes and lay down. And I didn't feel comfortable doing that, but I didn't really have a choice. And we took our shoes off and laid down. And once we laid down, they all started shouting at us. And the whole tank was covered with bodies. You know?
How many people were in the tank?
107. And they were on, when I first walked in, all I saw were this outline. And they were lying on tables, on benches, on the floor, you know, so you sort of saw this strange outline. I didn't know what the hell I was looking at.
Because it was dark.
Yeah.
Can you describe what it looked and smelled?
Huh?
Can you describe what it looked and smelled like walking in there?
Well, I had a hard time adjusting. I couldn't figure out, what is that? You know? What the hell is that? And after a while, it began to dawn on me, those were people who were trying to sleep. And then we were taken in the back and told to lay down. We lay down. And that's when they started beating us up. And of the people who surrounded us, half a dozen people, there was one in particular who was a real sadist. And he started pounding Steve's ribs, which was very painful. And Steve started screaming, and then the others started kicking Steve. We're all lying in a row. And then he jumped up, and I was looking around, and suddenly he came flying through the air at me and landed on me and the guy right next to me, Joe Stevenson, knelt down and started pounding me. And I started to panic, and I started to raise up. I was trying to run, and the more I raised up, the harder he hit me. And I realized I couldn't do that. I had to lie down and lay still, which was consistent with my youth in the ghetto, you know? That if you were being beaten up, that's how you didn't have the muscle that's how you handled it. And when I lay still, they only went a few more minutes, and then they stopped beating me up. And started beating up the others. Bob Kaufman and Steve Sanfield. But Steve Sanfield had already been beaten up and was heavily pounded. he got the Pilgrims Pounding. And Joe Stevenson, the youngest one of our group, flipped over on his tummy, lay still, and was completely overlooked. Wasn't beaten at all. So 3 of us were worked over, and Joe wasn't, you know? So finally, they stopped working us over, and the top con would walk around in a circle and scream at us and threaten to beat us up. And we were just frozen in fear, you know? And froze there for the rest of the night while they walked back and forth threatening to beat us up.
So what kind of injuries did you guys have at that point?
Well, I had a herniated disc, but I didn't know it, you know? I had these feelings, but I didn't realize it was a herniated disc. Bob was kicked in the face, banged up against the bars, and opened up a 2-inch wound behind his left ear. Steve was kicked in the left eye, which was very painful. And then he was also beaten up elsewhere. And that was what we experienced. And so, though the dawn slowly came, and we waited for dawn to come, and it slowly came, and then coffee arrived for the prisoner, and we were, in effect, we were slowly integrated into the group by the prisoners. In other words, they had been told to beat us up. The guards had told them to beat us up. They might have wanted to beat us up anyway, I'm not sure. But it was consistent, you know. Not all of them felt that way. Some of them felt that way. And half the prisoners were in locked cells, and the other half were in the dining area, where you had about 50 prisoners, you know, lying there. And we lay there for a couple hours. And I was so scared I didn't move for a couple of hours. And then as dawn came, and they slowly started letting the prisoners who ran the tank slowly started letting other prisoners and us actually stand up and, you know, kind of express ourselves a little bit, you know? We were allowed to have some coffee, and then the breakfast showed up, and as dawn came, everybody stood up, the whole tank stood up, and the tank basically came to life. And we're in the middle of 107 prisoners. And, you know, I didn't know what the story was. I don't know if they hated us or what. But as it turned out, not all of the white prisoners were against us. Some of them said they actually supported us, although when it came down to it, that wasn't the case. They didn't support us. It's too much to hope for. And then dawn came, started eating breakfast, which I think was just an oatmeal type cereal and and something to hold the breakfast. And we had a thing of black coffee, and suddenly they started treating us well. And the guy who actually ran the tank started treating us decently. You know?
The prisoner there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
You actually interact with some of the other prisoners.
Yeah, and we were very nervous about it, naturally, since we'd all been beaten up. None of the other prisoners at that moment. A little later, they started, approaching us individually. And several of them said they agreed with us. They were with us. Although as a practical matter, when the tank polarized 2 days later, they weren't there. You know? They didn't support us. So, but people would walk, you know what happened for us, we ate what happened. And I remember, one of the prisoners walked up to me and offered me his fork, which he had washed up. And I was reluctant to take it because I thought maybe he was coming on to me. I had no idea. But he was trying to show some sympathy for us, as did several others. So there were prisoners there who were trying to demonstrate some sympathy and support of what we were doing.
So what was the philosophy of CORE or your group in particular in terms of going bail or staying in prison if you were arrested?
We were supposed to stay in there until we were tried, which we didn't do. Because we were bailed out. We had to be bailed out. Because our lives were really threatened. You know, later, 2 days later.
What
Did-
happened then?
Were you all in agreement about that, or did you discuss it while you were in there?
No, we agreed to do whatever was necessary. And so that was pretty much it.
And what
We had to survive in the tank.
And you were there for 3 days?
2 days.
2 days? And then
About
what hap-
48 hours.
Okay. And then what happened at the end of that?
Okay. Do you want any of this information about those 2 days?
Yeah, sure.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was very interesting. First of all, it was the misdemeanor tank. All right? You had all kinds of prisoners there. You had people who had never been arrested before. You had people who were career criminals. The tank was controlled by a small clique. And the head con was known as the commander. His name was Garland, and he was in cell number 1. It had like 7 or 8 cells. And the first couple of cells were only occupied 50%. The members of cell number 1 would sleep in the bottom cells and put their own personal stuff on the top cells. Even the whole damn tank was overcrowded. Didn't matter. The lieutenant commander, Overstreet, roamed the tank, which was, there were 2 tanks. The whole area was called the tank, and then the dining area where we slept was also known as the tank. So the head of the tank, Overstreet, was commander of both the whole thing and was in charge of the dining area. While Garland would walk up and down, the hallway between the 2 areas and spent a lot of time trying to handle his own, he was just close to wit's end. he was pretty burned out. But that's how he survived, was by running the tank. And he was really the arm of the guard. Whatever they wanted, he did. Whatever he wanted to do, he would get their permission to do first, for the most part, depending on how important it was. So we were just kind of surviving, and we slowly got to meet and to know many of the prisoners. Then the prisoners would come up to us and insist that we were nigger lovers, and we were, sort of lucky to be alive. And some of those prisoners were very dangerous. There was a guy who was in charge of, what was he in charge of? I'm sorry. Well, there was one guy who came on the scene later who was the most dangerous guy in the jail. And he had been arrested for murder. I was in the felony tank. 3 guys, other prisoners, decided to jump him. And a buddy slipped him a razor blade. And he used that razor blade to cut their throats. And all 3 were hospitalized. He wasn't touched. He was real. I don't know how to tell you how dangerous it was. I mean, this guy, nobody would even interact with him without being scared to death. They would assign the oldest, shakiest guard to take it. He was in solitary confinement 6 days a week. And the oldest guard would walk him back to solitary confinement and would be shaking like a leaf. But they would assign him because he was no threat to the prisoner. They didn't want the prisoner to kill him. You know?
Why on earth were they putting him in the misdemeanor tank once a week?
Because they felt that if they didn't do that, he'd go crazy. It was to give him a little bit of freedom, some latitude. They wanted him to associate with other prisoners. He would spend the day socializing with him, playing cards with other prisoners. That's how bad he was.
I imagine it would sort of control the other prisoners, too, to have this very intimidating guy there.
He couldn't if he had wanted to, because Garland wasn't going to challenge him. Garland and Overstreet were scared to death of him. I mean, he would have killed him if he had wanted to. And, but he didn't care. He didn't care about the tank. He would spend the whole day playing cards with a few other prisoners.
So this is a long way from Stuyvesant High School and UCLA.
Oh, absolutely. Totally different, although it was all male. And he got into a minor confrontation with Garland. Garland said something to him, which was directive, and he turned around and challenged Garland, and Garland immediately backed off and apologized. And then he spent the whole day there, and that evening was taken back to isolation for the week. There was another guy who was, what was his name again? I'm sorry. But he had been arrested. He had run a small group of prostitutes, streetwalkers, and was beating them up on the side. And he was crazy. He wasn't actually crazy, but he was close to being crazy. And so he was very dangerous. But he wasn't going to challenge Garland and Overstreet, you know? Although he succeeded them when they left the tank. So, and then you had professional criminals who just cooled it. They didn't want to get into an argument with Garland and Overstreet. They just walked around. As long as they weren't pushed around, they wouldn't do anything. You know. So.
What was the second night like?
Well, it was funny because we were told to lay down in the same place, and a couple of the prisoners guarding us approached us to get some stuff off the line above us, and then we sat up and said, "Uh-oh," and then we were sure that, you know, that's okay, don't worry about it. And we spent the night, you know. The real sadist walked over and he wanted to beat us, kick us again. But by then, Overstreet and I had gotten together. And Overstreet had approached me and asked me if I could provide him with some shoes. He was barefoot. And I sort of looked down and I said, well, I don't know, so on and so forth. So we agreed that I might arrange for him to get a pair of shoes. I was shocked he didn't have any. And then when the sanist sort of walked up to us and stood there staring at us and trying to figure out how he was going to beat us up again, I looked up at Overstreet, who was resting on top of one of the tables, and sort of pointed it out to him. And our eyes met, and he realized that I felt threatened by this guy. And since he wanted the shoes, he needed to do something for me, that there would be a quid pro quo. And the quid pro quo was he would protect us, and I would arrange for him to get shoes. And he announced that. Said, I don't want anything happening. I don't want to hear anything. You know. And that'll be that. So we were kind of treated as independent. We weren't threatened. We were threatened, and then he stopped that night, and we just went to sleep, and woke up on day 2. More of the same. A couple of times when what's his name? The guy who was in charge of the tank. What was his name again? Garland. Confronted me once because he caught me staring at him, and he didn't like that. And then evening came, and it wasn't until our black attorney, George Washington Jr., showed up that night. Now, of all the tanks, for some reason, he showed up last at the white male misdemeanor tank. And it wasn't until he showed up that Overstreet and Garland. Well, what happened is we got a copy of an LA Times article that covered our arrest. And Garland took that article very personally and felt like he was the article was identifying him. You know, it identified that we'd been beaten up, I think. Or that we said we'd been beaten up. So it wasn't until George Washington Jr. showed up after dinner that Garland began to say, identify with George Washington Jr. And George Washington Jr., when he showed up, put his head up to the peephole, and Bob Coughlin was called up front. And when Bob Coughlin showed up, he turned and showed the wound behind his left ear. And George said, what's that? What happened to you? You know? And Coughlin said, later. And Garland went berserk. And he thought he was being blamed for the beating and would take the fall for the beating. And he didn't know what that would entail. So he went berserk, ran out of the cell, and started running around the tank, screaming out loud that he had beaten the shit out of us. And he would beat the shit out of us again if he wanted to. You know? And George, of course, said, what the hell is going on here? You know? And wanted to talk with Bob, and he called out to the guard, and the guard showed up, and George told the guard to pull Bob out of the tank and put him in a consultation cell outside so he could talk to him, which the guard did. And Garland I thought we were dead. I really did. The whole tank polarized. Steve and I backed up against some bars. Joe Stevenson was exactly opposite. He walked over and sat down about 10 feet from where Garland was doing all of this, screaming and running around, and cupped his hands, his chin in his hands, and started studying Garland. Stevenson and I said, holy shit, we're dead. We're going to get killed. And we really thought this was it. But then the guard came in and calmed Garland down enough so we weren't beaten. And the night supervisor came in and started talking to Garland and started to sort of bring him down, which took quite a while, 20 minutes. Convinced Garland that, he should ignore us, not beat us up, and cool it. And Garland finally threw up his hand and went back to his cell to get out of the whole situation, get away from us. And the whole tank had polarized. And guys were threatening to beat us up, and then they were all sort of calmed down by the supervisor. until after, the whole situation finally calmed down. And we were sent to lie down again. Well, we had a couple hours in which we walked around. And then Mom was still out for a couple hours. Princess would walk up to us and say, "Where's your buddy?" And we didn't know.
Yeah.
And then everybody had to go back to bed. Turn the lights off. Everybody had to lie down.
And what were you thinking and feeling at that point?
It looked like we were going to be all right, but you still didn't know. Didn't know. And finally, they started pulling us out. They pulled the three of us out of there and took us to a holding cell, an isolation cell. So we were released. We were removed and taken to an isolation cell. We bonded out. We had they had to get paper for the bond. Then we were taken to the cell where we were held until we were finally bonded out. And we were held there for a couple of hours. And we were told that, we could bond out in there, but we still weren't sure what was really going on, And then we got into an argument because Joe Stevenson didn't want to leave. He thought we could stay there. Not worry about being beaten up. Nobody was going to be beaten up. Everything had calmed down. Whereas the three of us, the other three, said, "Get us the hell out of here."
Right.
And I think we were a little more realistic than Joe was. And we were then removed from there, and they started bonding us out. So they took us to downstairs to get our clothes and our money, and we're taken down to the basement where we were bonded out. Into the main floor of the jail, and then out into the parking lot. And where we rejoined Bob, downstairs.
Right. What had happened to the other freedom riders who were in the other tanks?
Yeah, the others were still in their tanks. They didn't know about any of this.
Okay. And you didn't know what had been happening with them?
No. Although we didn't think they were having the same problem. We didn't think they were being threatened. And so within a 24-hour period, we were arrested, jailed, held in the tank, and bonded out. And we were taken to Mr. Theobroke's home at, midnight or so, where we had a drink and spent an hour or two talking about the whole experience, telling them, our attorney, and Theodore, what had happened, and the whole thing was shared.
You're bonded out, but you've got charges against you. So what happens?
Yeah, we were charged with unlawful assembly.
Right.
So we were out for a week. And we spent a week driving around, making some speeches, trying to raise some money. And then the court decided to get the others out. So they arranged for everybody to be released. And they were all released, and all of the freedom riders were out on the street in a week. Or maybe 9 days, I'm not sure which. And we were waiting to be tried. And we had a trial date, which was 30 days after we were arrested. And so we had 3 weeks in which to drive around, talk, and try to raise funds for the Freedom Ride. And that's what we did for 30 days.
So how did people react? Were you able to raise money, or people?
Yeah, we did raise some.
Yeah.
Did raise some.
And what was do you remember what the local media coverage was, local or national, of what had happened?
The local media coverage was pretty limited. We had the Houston Post did an article. We claimed that we'd been beaten up in jail, but the sheriff claimed that that wasn't true. You know? So they gave the sheriff as much credit as or more than they gave us. One TV station came over and interviewed us. I was standing there, my arms crossed, tightly wound. In fact, they focused on my hands, which were like that, and they interviewed us. They're saying we were beaten up, but they didn't necessarily believe us, you know? And it didn't matter. It didn't matter whether we were beaten up or not. Nobody was going to do anything about it, you know? So, that was it.
And so you're waiting a trial date? Or
Had a trial date,
Yeah.
and we're waiting trial. And the trial finally came, and we were tried. It was now the old court building, right across from the jail. We were tried for unlawful assembly. And we had 2 trials. The first time, there was a mistrial. The mistrial happened because the district attorney was trying to get rid of the phrase Union Center Coffee Shop, because it suggested interstate responsibility. And if we were covered, were we covered by federal law?
Right.
And so they dropped Union Center. It just said Union Coffee Shop. Okay? Some genius. And George Washington had prepared very thorough motions, one of which said there's a conflict here. He's not being he's being prosecuted for trespassing against the Union Coffee Shop, when in reality it was Union Station Coffee Shop. They have to be the same. You can't have 2 completely different entities.
Right.
So the judge, who was an ultra-conservative judge, denied the motion. They convened a jury, and the jury was a good jury. We might have won that case. It was a good jury. And then the judge, slowly dawned on the judge, our attorney was right. picked up the phone, called another judge, senior judge. This judge had just recently been appointed. He was a right to sue judge, a right to, what was the term I was looking for? Anyway, he put down the phone, he had to dismiss the case. Or it wouldn't have held up. Would have been reversed on appeal. So he dismissed the case, glibly apologized to the jury, and they convened they set a new trial date. Now, that's the bad news. The good news is, this is the difference between Mississippi and Texas. They willingly agreed to set the trial date so we would be all done within 30 days and we would be able to take the train back home and register for school. Okay? So instead of really screwing us, they're like, no, we're going to set this for October 1st, which would have killed our chances to go to UCLA. They accommodated us. Mississippi would have never done that. Yeah? Not at all. So that's the difference between Texas and Mississippi. Texas stopped just short of doing some of the things Mississippi was doing. And they cut some slack, and our attorney and Texas was able to work together some. There's a reason for that. The reason is that the judges realized that our attorneys were sort of setting a point at which we would be covered. We would be afforded. They had to be sure that the Texas lawyers were not angry. They knew they were only 2 years away from having to deal with these lawyers in terms of their own appointments as judges. And so they didn't really want to offend them. They wanted to accommodate them. And that's what happened. So both sides accommodated. In fact, one of them pulled one of our attorneys aside and offered him sort of an assignment that would reimburse him. They were trying to, they were smart enough to realize, it might not be this way all the time. They saw it coming. Whereas Mississippi judges forget about it. And that was nice. So the day came for another trial. And this time the jury was very bad. None of the jurors. We talked to a couple of the jurors after the first trial. And I remember going up to one of them who worked for a department store, major department store, and asked him what he thought. He said he was hoping we would win. Not the second jury, man. They don't want to have anything to do with us. So, it's strange because if we had won the first trial, on the one hand, it would have been a big win, but on the other hand, we would have nothing more to litigate. We wouldn't have established a precedent. We went on the facts. And instead, we were tried. The jury stayed out a little while that afternoon. And we were convicted. And we maintained a complete poker face
Mm-hmm.
when we were convicted. And as soon as we were convicted, we were out on bail, of course, $500 bail each. As soon as we were convicted, that was it. We were free. You know, I mean, our attorneys were gonna post an appellate bond,
Right.
but we had nothing more to worry about. And we went out for lunch, and we were on our way home within a couple of days on a train. Now, the train we left on was different from the train we came in on. We came in on Southern Pacific. I mean, we finally came in on Southern Pacific. No, we came in. I'm sorry, I'm a little confused. I think we finally we came in on Southern Pacific, and we left on, I can't remember what, Union Pacific?
Yeah, right. I think that's probably right.
And we boarded Union Pacific, got on, and by now, we were bitter, very bitter.
Yeah.
The girls, a couple of the girls had gone to Houston to spend a couple of days with black citizens there who wanted them, you know, to sort of take them around. Well, instead, these two guys used the opportunity to make passes at them, try to force them to have sex with them. And the girls wound up coming back and were very upset and had every reason to be upset. So, between what the girls experienced, our experience of being beaten up and being convicted when we should have been convicted, you know, in fact, legally, there was no basis for convicting us. The law protected us. We were kind of a bitter group. And we got on the train, and this time, instead of working with the porters, we fought the porters. And and the porters said, got angry with us. Understandably so.
Angry with you?
Yeah, because we were giving them a hard time. You know?
But why?
We were giving them a hard time because we felt we hadn't been treated right and they weren't entitled to any consideration. You know?
Even though they were on your side.
Yeah. And remember, we were coming back this time. So, the second day coming back was tense. Didn't get along with the porters. Nothing was built into the relationship that would have made it mutually supportive or communicative. We were going back and we were pissed off, and the porters were just going back. You know? We didn't have any, whether it was music or whatever it was.
Yeah. No freedom songs.
Huh?
No freedom songs this time.
No. And nothing else. You know? So we returned to LA and got off the train in Union Station. And then we went to a restaurant for lunch. What's the name of that French restaurant we went to? I can't remember the name of it. We all said goodbye to each other. And basically, we met by family and friends. We cheered us. And then we split up. And the freedom ride was over. And when I entered UCLA, a couple of days later, a few days later, a friend of mine grabbed me and said one of the professors there wanted me to do an oral history project. And they sent me over to the UCLA Oral History Project. And that's when I hunkered down. And it finally reached a point where we were taking so much. I was saying so much. And in so much detail, as you can tell from my printout, that the oral history project was coming to me and said, Steve, stop it. Stop talking. You know, damn it. You know, there was one woman who was typing for weeks at a time, and
It's about 400 pages of transcript.
yeah. And I wouldn't stop. And then later, a couple of years later, the same people came to me and said, you know, we're glad you did that. You have a great oral history project. Most of our oral history projects weren't that good. They had a lot of bullshit oral history projects. And Tom Bradley's oral history project was a joke. So I did it big time. And then later, first of all, the summer after, at my own expense, I went back to Houston to get more information. And that's when I realized that Hogan Brooks, you know, was on the other side of the line in terms of crime, although he bailed us out. He put up a $35,000 bond, you know, land bond, to get us out of there. He got us out within a couple of hours. And, you know, that's when I learned more about the PSA people and their backgrounds.
PSA? Oh, Progressive.
PYA, Progressive Youth Association. Yeah. And, you know, more about their background. Learn more about George's background and Haman's background. Well, George and Haman by that time had sold out big time to John Connolly, who was running against Ralph Yarbrough for the U.S. Senate. I believe it was the U.S. Senate, it might have been governor, I'm not sure which. And Washington and Yarbrough had been paid off. So everything they did was pro-Connolly. And, which wasn't right, you know? But still, I was digging into that and getting some of that information. I tried to get Bob Eckhart to sue the sheriff, and he wouldn't do it because at that time, there was no law supporting such an action, you know?
Right.
It wasn't until several years later that there was law supporting that kind of lawsuit. Then I returned to UCLA and came back later. And meanwhile, I was trying to get everything I could get, you know. And interviewed with an assistant U.S. attorney, didn't give a shit. There was a black assistant U.S. attorney who didn't care. And Ralph Yarbrough was a liberal politician, a great guy, who cared, but wasn't going to represent us or anybody else, you know. So that's what happened.
Yeah. So when you were back at UCLA, trying to resume your studies, I assume, but also, did you resume your political activity or?
Yeah,
civil rights activity?
I went to town. I mean, I didn't care. I was out to exploit my role as a freedom rider and be the big-time freedom rider, Mr. Freedom Ride on that campus. And by then, I had a herniated disc in my back. The pain had subsided. The pain did not subside, but some of the aches and pains subsided, leaving me with a very painful disc. And I went to UCLA. I checked into the UCLA Student Health Center for a month. You know,
Yeah.
it was painful. And I was idolized by almost everybody else and exploited it. You know?
In what way?
Well, I don't know. Anything involving freedom rides, I was the leader. You know?
Did the others experience the same thing? Or?
No. I took it to, I played it to the hilt. I played it to the hilt. And there was nothing wrong with that, in many respects. But only when I played it to the hilt did I develop additional standing as a freedom rider, you know? Additional things. Whatever it might be. Giving talks, you know, whatever. And, you know, was known as a freedom rider and been beaten up in jail from then on,
Right.
you know? Which reinforced my feelings of inadequacy. You know, I started to reinforce myself. And, you know, contributed to my standing in the movement. I was the only one on the West Coast who had that experience. So over a period of time, I was exposed to more and more people. And I would do more and more things. Anybody who came to LA, whether it was Chuck McDew or whom it might be, would check in with me.
Did you maintain close contacts with CORE in LA?
As close as I could. Came to New York, I tried to look up Jim Farmer. I was pretty much ignored, but I remember buying Farmer's book and reading it while I was waiting for him to drop by the office. I mean, I completely idolized
Yeah.
both Farmer and CORE. And got to know more and more about them. You know?
So what happened with the appeal?
Oh, it went to the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals, and they voted to reverse our conviction, which they did. Ironically, one of the black freedom riders, who was particularly intelligent and well educated, discovered a Texas statute that said you could not discriminate against people based on their race in transportation.
Oh.
So here we had a statute that had apparently been passed as they were desperately trying to bridge a situation with overseas visitors or whatever. And we already had the statute we needed to protect our rights to take the train. And yeah. What else?
So talk about when you're back at UCLA and the National Student Association work? Should we
Sure.
talk about that? Okay.
Okay, we're going.
Okay, so we're back, and if you could tell me a little bit about, after you've come back from the Freedom Ride, the work that you're doing, especially with the National Student Association.
Yeah, but I was still mostly committed to the civil rights movement. I was kind of dabbling in the National Student Association, although I did it over a 4 or 5 year period. I was able to do both because they didn't always overlap. I kept going to National Student Congress, and I was threatening to run for national office. And finally, I had a very bad Congress, which I really screwed up and did very badly. And instead of running for national office, I was offered this job of civil rights director, which actually was much better. And I became civil rights director, moved to Philadelphia for a year, and lived in Philadelphia because NSA's headquarters was located in Philadelphia. Okay? From day one, I was involved with the movement. My very first event was a trip to Atlanta for an interagency conference of civil rights organizations, and then to Jackson and Macomb, Mississippi for demonstrations. So I remember arrived in Jackson, Mississippi, checked in with SNCC, and drove down to Macomb. There had been 11 bombings in 22 days in Macomb. This was after Goodman, Schwerner, and Cheney were murdered. Right after. Okay, or not right after, actually, it was maybe a month after. But what happened is that the civil rights movement SNCC started holding demonstrations in Macomb, which was really the headquarters of the white movement in Mississippi. What was it called?
The Klan?
Huh?
The Ku Klux Klan or someone?
No, it was very similar.
The White Citizens
Council.
White Citizens
Yeah.
Organization.
And so we drove down to Macomb. And as I flew into Meridian, Mississippi, from Atlanta, and from Meridian to Jackson, the closer I got to Jackson, the more scared I got. And I really started to get scared. Because all I had had was my imagination for more than a year. And probably because I have a bipolar condition, that had really run the gauntlet. I mean, I was having dreams every night for a year at least, and reliving everything. I still have a dream occasionally. So we arrived in Jackson, rented a car, visited SNCC, and drove down to Macomb and checked into, I forget what, probably, what's the major motel, Holiday Inn, or whatever. Then we went to a rally, okay? By now, I am really scared, okay? I mean, I'm having a hard time holding myself together. It's a good thing I'm not really panicking. We had the rally, returned to our motel, and about 4 o'clock in the morning, we pull out to catch a plane at the airport. As we pull out, we're right across the police station. A police officer opens the window, puts his hands on his hip, leans out the window and stares at us. That's his way of telling us, don't come back. And so we drove back to the airport and flew back to Atlanta. And that was the story that trip. What else?
What kind of things were, what kind of civil rights activities was the National Student Association involved in at this?
Well,
And how involved?
this is where it gets interesting.
Yeah.
First of all, I have to tell you very candidly, but not very modestly, I was probably the best staff person on the domestic side of NSI. And I started off right away raising money for the Thanksgiving Fast for Freedom, through the Thanksgiving Fast for Freedom, so that the Thanksgiving Fast for Freedom would subsidize the purchase of canned goods and what have you to feed people in Mississippi. Okay? Interestingly enough, what happened is we raised $38,000, which was a substantial amount at the time.
Yeah.
But what happened, I was going 24 hours a day, psychologically and creatively, driving myself. And I felt kind of guilty. I didn't feel I had handled myself right. I felt like I had exploited the movement. And I wanted to come back to right by the movement.
In what way? From the Freedom Riot, do you mean?
Yeah. Even though I had done right by the movement, still not as right as I would have liked to. So I came up with the idea of petitioning the Department of Agriculture to take the $38,000 and use it to sign up as many counties in Mississippi as you could to the surplus food program that they ran. Okay? And on top of that, I came up with the idea. You have to understand, my mind was going 24 hours a day. I mean, these, I think, are very creative decisions. On the one hand, I was tremendously driven on the other hand. Okay? And I'll explain some of the consequences of this. So I said to Steve Robbins, who was president of NSA, a friend from UCLA, we ought to go to the Commission on Religion and Race, National Council of Churches, and try to have a relationship with them to do this. And they certainly have more going for them than we do. They had programs in Mississippi, and elsewhere in the South. And he agreed, so I contacted Bob Spike, and who was head of the Commission on Religion and Race, and he put me in touch with Art Thomas, who was head of the Delta Ministry. And Art and I, we started organizing this, and by then, I was participating in the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights in Washington, and using contacts I made in Washington. Bill Seabrun, who was Civil Rights Director, I think, for the Department of Agriculture, and we started putting this scheme together. Okay? At the same time, the guy who was in charge of the surplus food program saw his opportunity to expand the program.
Hmm.
So we were in accord, except I was pissed off because instead of actually distributing food and having a program, we started knocking off counties. County after county, this way a guy would enlist in the program. And he would go to the county and say, hey, listen, I've got the National Student Association here and the National Council of Churches. And if you don't join our program, there's something like only less than 20% of Mississippi's surplus food program is actually enrolled in distributing surplus food. He said, we'll just give the money to we'll let the Commission on Religious Rights, National Council, distribute the food, and you'll have them in your county. Of course, no county wanted them, right? They don't want the commission and the National Council of Churches in their county.
Right.
And so, as time passed, that fall, winter, and spring, we started enrolling more and more counties until by springtime, every county in Mississippi was enrolled in the surplus food program, and this guy wanted us to shift to Alabama. I was hysterical. But I was pissed off because I actually wanted to see food distributed.
But it wasn't being.
No.
Yeah.
But this guy was actually right. That was a better alternative. So that's what happened. And we had, on Thanksgiving, with schools and colleges all over the United States fasting, and we were getting the money that would have been used to buy food, that they would have used to buy food, was going to us for this program.
Mm-hmm.
And it just worked out beautifully. It was great.
So and through the program, what actually happened?
Well, what happened is every county in the state of Mississippi joined the surplus food program in the Department of Agriculture.
Right. And they got.
Yeah.
And what happened through them?
Food was distributed
So it did work.
to everybody in Mississippi. Black people who couldn't get food before were getting food. So we took the surplus food program, which was like maybe 70% enrolled, boosted it to 100%, and blacks all over the state were getting food. Surplus food and living on it. So that's a tremendous accomplishment. We also had something called Books for Equal Opportunity, when we raised books. We got students and institutions to donate books to Mississippi. And that was going on. So those were two major programs that we were, we had caused to happen.
And then what was next for you?
We're also deeply involved in the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and later the Voting Rights Act.
Yeah.
And I got a White House pen used to sign the Voting Rights Act. I was invited to the ceremony. So one of the things I have at home is the White House pen.
So what kinds of things did you do to support those acts, and how important do you think those acts
Participate in the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, which is the Civil Rights Lobby in Washington. Go once a week to Washington
Oh, wow. Yeah.
and participate. And try to goad them into doing more. They got so they hated me. Because every time I showed up, I would demand more. You know? It was funny. Everybody else was organized labor. They hated SNCC. Hated SNCC. So when I showed up and basically lined up with SNCC every week,
Yeah.
they didn't like me either. But there were a couple of very important people who did. Joe Rao did.
So, once those acts were actually adopted, how did you feel that you had accomplished what you needed to accomplish, or what did you see?
We accomplished a lot more. When I reported back to the National Student Congress the next summer, the summer of '65, they were flabbergasted. I mean, we accomplished more in 1 year than NSA had accomplished in its entire history. You know? And the civil rights directors who replaced me, if I may say so, didn't hold a candle to what I was doing. They didn't get anything like that participation, nothing. They were basically going through the motions, basically. They weren't doing much.
What made you?
They weren't as driven as I was.
I was just going to ask, what made you so driven? Do you think?
Well, part of it was that when I relocated to Philadelphia, I would spend time in New York and with student organizations. We had the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was organizing Congress people to try to get the vote for MFDP instead of the Mississippi delegation. One of the people I met there was Rita Schwerner. And Rita and I became quite close.
The name again?
Rita Schwerner, Mickey Schwerner's widow. And we became quite close. And she was a real conscience for me. Not that I didn't have a conscience, but if anything, she accentuated it. She was more militant than I was. She was great. Very strong person. Had a mind like a steel trap. And was committed to Mickey and his memory. Had many opportunities to exploit that, never exploited it. She was a piece of work. And she was one of the most important people in the movement. Although most people didn't realize that. People in the movement understood that. People like Larry Guillot and John Lewis. All of them. When Mickey was killed, John Lewis sent Bob Zellner, white Southerner, an experienced civil rights hand, to stay with her in Philadelphia. And he did. And he escorted her for a few days, at least. Jim Farmer didn't do that. You know, he started making speeches. So, that had a lot to do with it. You know? I was a purist.
I think we should be.
Yeah, take just maybe 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes. I'm sorry that.
That's all right. I was a purist. That's what happened with MFDP. And I became a member of the MFDP Congressional Strategy Committee. So it got to the point where once a week I go down to Washington for a strategy meeting, which was extremely educational. I was exposed to the whole MFDP. When I returned to UCLA in the fall, I arranged with the National Council of Churches to send me to Washington for 2 weeks so I could investigate exactly what happened and was able to establish that the White House had intervened behind the scene to oppose the challenge. And nobody knew that, you know, but it was true. The guy in the AFL-CIO kept telling me that. And so, and then when I was with, when I was with SNCC and with MFDP, Walter Reuther's brother showed up in Washington and took us out to dinner, which was nice. So I was sort of at these, I happened to be in certain places at certain times.
Very important times.
Yeah, I was.
Let me just ask a final question, if I could, which
Sure.
is just ask you if there's anything else that you'd like to say or anything that I should have asked about that I didn't ask about.
It's a shame that the AFL-CIO and especially the NAACP was so anti-SNCC. They hated SNCC. And I mean hated them. I couldn't even talk to anyone in the NAACP about SNCC. I tried to get Clarence Mitchell, who was head of the NAACP office, to attend a meeting in the Secretary of Agriculture's office about food distribution. He wouldn't do it. He invented an excuse. He wouldn't do it. Joe Rout did it. I was terrible. They were paranoid.
Yeah.
They were paranoid. They thought the AFL-CIO was largely populated in the leadership conference by people who were either the children, relatives, or maybe old associates of AFL-CIO people who were involved in the 1930s organizing drive and who fought the communists. And so they were convinced. They saw all of these SNCC people, many of whom's parents had been communists in the 30s. And so they just adamantly opposed them. Well, in reality, these guys weren't out to exploit them,
Sure.
you know? And so that's what happened. It's a shame, but it's true.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll stop there if that's all right with you.
Sure.
And let me just thank you one more time for
My pleasure.
all of this time that you gave us and
That's all right.
for the work that you did. So
No
thank
problem.
you very much.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It's, an eye-opener for me too.
Okay.
These stories.
And it's an honor for us to get to talk.
My honor, my pleasure. My privilege.
Okay.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress and the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture.